I'm here with Dr. James H. Bray, Associate Professor of Family and Community Medicine and Psychiatry at Baylor College of Medicine and Adjunct Psychology Professor at the University of Houston. He's also the immediate past president of the American Psychological Association. We're going to talk about a new APA task force report called Helping People Without Homes, the Role of Psychologists and Recommendations to Advance Training, Research, Practice, and Policy. This report was compiled by Dr. Bray's Presidential Task Force on Psychology's Contribution to End Homelessness. So let me start by noting that you've done a great deal of work with the homeless, which led to your convening this task force. What were you hoping to achieve by bringing together this group of researchers to study this issue?
Well, what I wanted to do is really shine a light on the whole issue of homelessness and bring it to awareness to not only psychologists, but hopefully the public at large. And I also wanted to make psychologists aware of the kinds of things that we can do to help end homelessness, because homelessness is more than just not having a roof over your head. The way and why people get there is often because of psychological issues and psychological problems.
So could you summarize some of the key findings of the report?
Well, first of all, it's clear that psychologists can make a big difference in helping people who are homeless get back into having productive lives. Many people who are homeless suffer from not only mental disorders but substance abuse problems. Many of them have experienced years of physical and sexual abuse, and these are things that psychologists can help treat them to help them get and be productive lives and productive citizens again. In addition, the report points out about the impact not only of adults but also children and adolescents. Many adolescents are homeless, and helping them get back into the mainstream of society so they're not harmed by their being on the streets. And children also are impacted, as families are being homeless more and more these days because of the downturn in the economic situation. It's clear that we have important research that's already been done around substance abuse and treatment, and particularly the issues that homeless people face around those issues. We need some more research in that area. We also, the report points out that we need to help the policymakers understand that spending money just providing roofs over people's head is simply not enough.
So what roles are psychologists currently playing with respect to homelessness, and what roles did the task force recommend for the future?
Well, what roles people are playing now is people are doing research in the area and with specific populations of homelessness, because there are different needs for different folks. For example, the veteran homeless have different needs than people who have serious and persistent mental illness versus people who are adolescents. So what the task force did a good job of doing is pointing out these different areas and these different needs. The task force also pointed out how there are prevention programs that we can provide and intervene to help people not become homeless. And those are important areas not only that we can intervene now, but also it's areas in which we need to do future research as well. We also need to look at how people can become resilient in these times of stress. Unfortunately, with the economic downturn, more people are experiencing homelessness, and we need to help them be resilient in these regards.
One of the issues that came up as I was reading the task force report was how to define homelessness, and I thought that was kind of interesting. Can you talk about how the task force wrapped their arms around that question?
Well, you know, there's an amazing number of people who are homeless at any point in their time, in their lives, and then there are the chronically homeless, people who are out there and because of many life circumstances choose to live outside rather than in a home. And those folks have different needs. We also know that there are different families and adolescents who are out there and being homeless. And now we have people who are working poor who are basically homeless. They've lost their houses because of economic downturn, but they still have jobs, and we don't really think of them oftentimes as homeless, but they are.
And speaking of the economic downturn, then, do you think that the problem is worsening? Is that what you're experiencing out there in your community?
It is worsening because it's interesting. About 20 years ago, the APA focused on homelessness, and it was at a time in our country when there was an economic downturn too. And you know, we started this task force and this initiative before, you know, the U.S. economy kind of went to the pits. And unfortunately, we are focusing on it now. More and more people are going to lose their homes because of the credit market and the mortgage crisis in the United States. And again, these are people who are not your traditional, when people think about who's a homeless person, these are working folks who have been living basically middle-class lifestyles, and because of economic turndowns, they're living, on the edge, and they miss their 1 or 2 paychecks, and now they're out on the streets.
Were there any findings in the report that came as a surprise to you or the other task force members?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. First of all, I was surprised at all of the research that's already been done on the homeless and the way in which psychologists have been contributing for many, many years. Oftentimes, this research has focused in targeted areas like treatment of people with HIV/AIDS or people with substance abuse problems. But the underlying theme about some of this is that these folks are often on the streets, and being on the streets, it increases their risk for other kinds of psychological trauma and problems. The other thing that I think was surprising was that we know now that providing what's often called wraparound services to people are effective ways in which you can help people become productive citizens again.
And how will you and APA use this report to affect change?
Well, our plan is to, once the report is approved by the Council of Representatives, our plan is to go to policymakers, members of Congress, and their staffs and point out the importance of providing psychological and mental health services to people who are homeless. This is not only to help them cope with the immediate stress of being homeless, but also to point out the need for additional resources or redirecting some of the resources that are already there for housing to make sure that people have adequate mental and psychological services to help them cope with these issues. A third area that we really want to focus on, because President Obama has made this a highlight of his administration, is ending homelessness with veterans. And the goal is to end homelessness for veterans within 5 years. And there are substantial amounts of new funding that are being proposed to do this. And again, educating the administration about the trauma that people have experienced around war, the mental illness that oftentimes they suffer because of being in war. Those folks need those kinds of psychological help so that they're no longer living on the streets. So one of the things that this report really points out is the need for increased funding for psychological research and some research around prevention and intervention programs. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration is currently the main place where this funding is found, but it's woefully lacking. It's not sufficient for the crisis that we have in America right now. And so we need additional research not only for SAMHSA but other areas. HUD needs to use some of its funds to evaluate effective programs to help people who are homeless get back on their feet. And this is a place where I think is an important area. And other places in which we can infuse funding like juvenile justice system, because adolescents who are homeless often end up in the juvenile justice system because they don't have, they break the law in order to just survive out on the street. So we need that kind of funding. In addition, we need to make sure that graduate students during their training programs are involved in working with the homeless so that they understand the variety of people who are out there like that and who can make a difference in their lives. So these are some other areas that we need to work on.
The report also involved a member survey, and one of the things that's mentioned in the report is that there will be some more analyses forthcoming. What kinds of information might we expect to see out of that?
Well, what we hope is to find out who out in the psychological community is working with the homeless. Do people provide pro bono services? One of my dreams in setting up this task force was that we would provide a national pro bono network for people so that when people are homeless and they're often in public health and public service kinds of settings, but they get on their feet, that's when they need to continue to have some services. And oftentimes they're in that kind of in-between place where they may be working poor, don't have benefits. If they could be connected with a psychologist who could help them continue to cope and remain stable, I think that that would benefit them a long way. And oftentimes, you know, psychologists already provide those services, and that's what the survey was about, is to find out what exactly are people doing out there? Are people aware of the need that homeless have? Are they aware of the broad spectrum that people often are who are homeless? And so that we can get psychologists working in that direction.
Mm-hmm. So do you believe that the United States will solve the homeless problem in our lifetimes?
I think there's a possibility for that. I think that with the kinds of resources that are here in America that we certainly could do that, but it's going to take not only providing housing, but also that we provide psychological services for these folks, help them develop coping skills and ways to live productive lives. And I think these are things that psychologists and other mental health professionals can do.
Anything else in the report that you want the community to know about?
Well, what I really hope that people will realize is the diversity of people who are often homeless and how many people are not chronically homeless. There are many, many people. When I worked with the homeless myself, I met people who had advanced degrees, and they got hooked on crack or cocaine. They weren't able to practice their trade, and then they ended up on the streets. Or I met women who were working poor and had to make a decision about whether to take their child to the doctor or to go to work. And sometimes they would take their child to the doctor, they'd be fired, and then they ended up homeless. You know, I met people who had long lives of productive working, and then something would happen. A family member would get ill, or they would get ill, and they would lose their jobs and their benefits, and they would end up on the streets. These are the kind of people that we often don't think about as homeless. We often think of people as the chronically mentally ill, or the chronically people who are out there, or the panhandlers who truly probably aren't homeless oftentimes, but they're out there begging for money. We have the opportunity here to really help a lot of people get off the streets and become productive citizens again. And that's what this report, I think, points out.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.